You're listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you. The Central Cast is recorded before a live audience every week at our church in Glendale, California. Thanks for tuning in.
When I was at Fuller Seminary about 20 years ago now, I began to really wrestle with my faith. I had a friend back then named Dan Magis who instigated a lot of this wrestling. Dan was further along in his deconstruction than anyone else I knew at Fuller, and he asked a lot of good questions. He wasn't well liked, but I liked him because he was honest and smart, although a bit extreme and weird, but no one's perfect. Isn't it interesting, though, that one can often trace the steps of their spiritual journey down to the relationships they have and the people they meet, which I think is really cool because I think faith and spirituality should be relational and social and about what we discover together with others, instead of it just being a private affair or something we do on our own. I'm so proud of the fact that Bob, Max, and I went through deconstruction together here at Central over the last 15 years or so. For those of you who don't know, Bob and Max have been my partners in ministry basically from the last 15 years. And we've been through so much change together, and we've never had a theological fight. We've never been like, you can't believe that, or you can't stop believing that, is probably more likely. But that's never happened because I think we've always been more focused on honesty and humility and creating a church culture that's more values-based rather than beliefs-based. But we processed and discovered that together. We created that together with all of you. It happened in community and in relationship with others, and I think that's the way it should be. It was my friendship with Dan Magis in seminary that was the most influential relationship I had at that time for my faith. He made me wrestle with it in ways I never had before. One of those areas was about atonement. Atonement is this idea that God can't forgive our sins and let us into heaven or love us and accept us without an act of violence, like a blood sacrifice. Even though I can forgive someone without needing violence, God apparently cannot, I was told, which didn't make a lot of sense to me, this idea that I can do something good that God cannot do. The whole atonement system just fell apart for me during seminary. The idea that the creator of the universe needed the blood of bulls and goats or a perfect human sacrifice in the form of his own innocent son, no less, to love and accept us, just began to seem absolutely crazy to me. But I couldn't dispense with it entirely because it was it was core to the faith, at least core to traditional Christianity, and I really wanted to remain traditional. Got to pay the bills, right? So I reasoned that God must be using atonement rituals and blood magic as an object lesson to communicate to us the seriousness of sin. In other words, I came to believe there was nothing supernatural or magical about ritual sacrifices. I didn't think the creator of the universe believed in blood magic or in the supernatural efficacy of such ritual sacrifices. Plus, I understood at that point that the Israelites clearly got their ritual sacrifice traditions, their atonement traditions, from their pagan neighbors, who were sacrificing animals on altars to their gods long before the Israelites were. And so I reasoned that ritual sacrifice was just the best object lesson God could use to communicate to the ancients and to us the seriousness of sin and why we need to take things like rape, murder, and theft seriously. What's more serious than a blood sacrifice, right? But eventually that atonement as object lesson way of thinking, that theory collapsed for me too. And it collapsed because the more time that passed, the more ad hoc and desperate it all seemed. I was bending over backwards and performing all these intellectual gymnastics in a desperate attempt to stay orthodox and traditional, which began to seem kind of dishonest and unhealthy to me. I mean, it wasn't just the beliefs themselves that were unhealthy and unethical, like believing in this God who needed to use violence and bloodshed for one reason or another, but the intellectual gymnastics needed to maintain those beliefs, the suspension of reason, the living in denial, the suppression of my cognitive dissonance. It all began to feel unhealthy and unethical too, like I was, living in denial. And so the whole thing fell apart for me. And it was the best thing that could have happened, because it was then that I was free to discover for myself what I really believed about God, Jesus, and the Bible and Christianity. And this is what I really want to talk about today. I want to talk about what it means to take ownership of our faith and to take responsibility for it and what that looks like. We often can only do that after we experience a collapse of our belief system. It's often only after that collapse that we can realize we are responsible for what we believe, and we are free to believe whatever we want. And that freedom and responsibility can be a very hard thing to accept. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "We are condemned to be free," which sounds like an oxymoron, right? What could be bad about freedom? How could we experience freedom as a negative or as condemnation? Well, I think he was talking about how the freedom of choice can often be overwhelming and confusing and burdensome. Anyone that's ever had a hard time choosing what to stream on Netflix knows what I'm talking about. I remember wandering around Blockbuster Video for hours back in the 90s when I was in high school, wandering around Blockbuster Video for hours on a Friday night with my friends trying to find something to watch. It was terrible. There was too many choices, and we were overwhelmed by the freedom of choice, right? We are condemned to be free. Sigmund Freud understood this too and said that people generally don't want the freedom and responsibility to figure out what they believe and think. They don't want this freedom and responsibility because they don't want to have to do the hard work of having to engage in critical thought and practice critical self-reflection in order to make such tough decisions. They would much rather depend on someone else to do all that for them, like an authority figure. And for this reason, Freud once said, most people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility, end quote. Tyrants and dictators understand this all too well and depend upon it to rule the masses and to seize power. We're living in this situation today. Such tyrants depend upon ignorance and naivete and people's apathy and people's desire to have someone else to just tell them what to believe and think. Tyrants of all sorts depend upon this, whether we're talking about pastors or presidents, ministers or monarchs. Many of them depend upon the fact that people just want some authority to tell them what to think and believe. And it's not to say, that we shouldn't trust authority figures. It's just that we shouldn't trust them too much, which means you shouldn't trust me too much. How many pastors have you heard say that? I may be a pastor and been to seminary and ordained and even wrote a book that at least one person's read. But you shouldn't trust me too much either. You have a responsibility to think on your own, to read, and to be in dialogue with others about what's real and true. This is what it looks like to take ownership of our faith. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, and actually it's two stories that are very similar to each other, are the stories where Abraham and Moses argue with God and stop him from killing a bunch of people. Moses in Exodus 32 intercedes on behalf of the people who fashioned the golden calf and stops God from wiping them all out in a fit of rage. And in Genesis 18, we find Abraham doing something similar and stopping God, at least for a little while, from wiping out the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because there were some righteous people there, like Lot and his family. Abraham argued, "Far be it from you, Lord, to do what is evil and unjust." In both stories, Abraham and Moses changed God's mind and basically argued, "God, you can't do this. This is immoral and unjust. You cannot kill all these people. You're better than this, God. Come on, And God listened and relented, we're told, which is a fascinating idea. Here we find mere mortals giving counsel to the Most High, which is an amazing idea, and thereby revealing that they're maybe more moral and just than God. Now, obviously, I don't read these stories as literal, and they're probably here to exalt the patriarchs and show how close to God they were and how we should revere them too. But I think the stories also represent a kind of unconscious belief in the ancient Hebrew mindset that we are responsible for the gods we believe in. In a way, our gods answer to us because they are us and we are they. It's quite clear throughout the Old Testament that Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, he went by different names. It's quite clear that the God of the ancient Israelites was a projection. He was a projection of their fears and desires, their biases and prejudices, their social, cultural understanding, and their worldview. And this is true of all gods everywhere. Our gods are projections of ourselves, our fears and desires, our biases and prejudices, our social, cultural understanding, and our worldview. These stories of Moses and Abraham changing God's mind was an unintended or unconscious demonstration of this, I think, a Freudian slip, if you will, found in the text. They weren't so much changing God's mind, but their own. It's like that joke that I've told before about the chicken farmer who was terrified his chickens were going to eat him because he was suffering under the delusion that he was chicken feed. Eventually, he got therapy and got over this delusion that he was chicken feed, but he was still terrified that his chickens were going to eat him. And so his therapist was like, "Why are you still afraid your chickens are going to eat you?" The farmer replied, "Well, I know I'm not chicken feed anymore, but who's going to tell my chickens that? Who's going to convince them?" This is the way we are with our gods quite often. They are our chickens. They are unconscious projections of our fears and desires. Have you ever noticed how strange it is that the God in evangelical America is strangely pretty white and evangelical? This God is pro-Second Amendment, anti-gay, anti-woke, patriotic, and capitalist. It's a bit of a coincidence, right? And what about us on the left? Do we think God is a Marxist or a Democrat? Even we progressives and leftists project ourselves unconsciously onto God. And maybe we can't avoid it to some degree. The trick is to be able to admit this and thereby rob it of its power over us. Maybe that's the best we can do. But this is why I think we need to be mystics and stop thinking of God as a being. It's just too easy to project ourselves onto him if we think of him ontologically as a being like us. So for me, I follow the ancient mystics and say, God is not a being, but the beingness of beings. God is the ground of being. God is the mystery, the cosmic mind, which undergirds all of life and being. God is the deepest depth dimension to life and being, things like love and connection and oneness. This, for me, is what it means to take ownership and responsibility for my faith. And the question, of course, becomes, what does this look like for you? This last week, Dr. James Dobson died, the founder of Focus on the Family. And really, he was one of the major players on the Christian right who shaped and formed evangelicalism today, over the last 40 years or so. And so a lot of people on social media this week were celebrating his death, and who could blame them? As Proverbs 11:10 says, when the wicked perish, the people rejoice, right? But they were also sharing about the negative impact he had on their lives while growing up, how his diabolical teachings on Christian child rearing brought them so much trauma at the hands of their evangelical parents. And a lot of purity culture came out of Focus on the Family and related publications. And so a lot of us deconstructed former evangelicals, credit him as a big reason for our departure from the faith. And again, who could blame such folks, right? These people refuse to carry forward his teachings in their own families and lives. And this too is what it looks like to take responsibility for our faith and to take ownership of it, if for no other reason than to leave certain gods and certain faiths behind, if not the entirety of one's faith. The question is, what does taking ownership and responsibility for your faith look like for you? What choices have you had to make? What or who has shaped and informed those choices? I want to thank you for listening today. Unfortunately, the discussion portion of our talk today had some technical difficulties, and so we weren't able to include it. Check us out again later. Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.